Can you imagine a child growing up in a 40-room mansion and never once being tucked in with Love Isabella is 4 years old? She's never been sung a lullaby, never felt a mother's hug, because her billionaire father believes love is a weakness. Here's the truth most people miss. Emotional attachment doesn't protect children. It breaks them. And the more perfect the system he built, the lonelier his daughter became. But the person who changed everything, not a therapist, not a top-tier nanny, just one woman, with no degrees, only a broken heart and the memory of the child she once lost. In this story, you'll witness a lullaby in Spanish that put a grieving child to sleep for the first time in 61 nights, and the moment she whispered mama to someone who didn't share her blood, just her pain. Isabella used to sit in silence, no smiles, no tantrums, just compliance, until Carmen sang, and the little girl laughed, clung, and called out mama so loudly it echoed through the marble halls. When Carmen was forced to leave, Isabella screamed herself hoarse, her heart shattered. And if you think that was the most emotional moment, you're wrong, because in just a minute, you'll witness a billionaire face the most human decision of his life. Keep control, or give his daughter the one thing she's never had, a mother's love. Have you ever wondered what it's like for a child to grow up without a mother's love? To never hear the soft whisper of a lullaby or feel the gentle touch of someone who loves you unconditionally? If you've ever felt that money can't buy everything, you'll understand why this story left me in tears. The Blackstone estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, was a monument to success and isolation in equal measure. The 40-room mansion sat on 50 acres of perfectly manicured grounds, every detail designed to project power, wealth, and control. But inside the marble halls and behind the crystal chandeliers lived the loneliest little girl in the world. Isabella Blackstone was 4 years old and had never known her mother's embrace. Victoria Blackstone had died during a complicated delivery, leaving behind a grief-stricken husband and a daughter who would grow up surrounded by luxury but starved of the one thing money couldn't provide: maternal love. Alexander Blackstone, CEO of Blackstone Technologies and one of the world's youngest billionaires, approached fatherhood the same way he approached business, with rigid structure, clear expectations, and professional management. Love in his mind was something that happened when all other needs were properly met. Emotion was inefficient. Attachment was weakness. Isabella's daily routine was managed by a succession of highly credentialed nannies, each selected for their impressive resumes and professional training in child development. Mrs. Patterson from the prestigious Norland College had lasted 3 months before resigning, citing irreconcilable differences in child-rearing philosophy. Miss Thompson, with her master's degree in early childhood education, had made it 6 weeks before declaring the position emotionally unsustainable. The problem wasn't Isabella. She was a sweet, intelligent child who craved nothing more than warmth and connection. The problem was Alexander's insistence that his daughter's care follow strict protocols designed to prevent inappropriate emotional dependency. No singing during bedtime, no physical comfort beyond what was medically necessary, no personal stories or family traditions that might blur the boundaries between employee and family. Alexander had hired these women to provide professional childcare services, not to become surrogate mothers. In his mind, allowing Isabella to form deep emotional attachments to temporary caregivers would only lead to abandonment trauma when those employees inevitably moved on to other positions. What he didn't understand was that his 4-year-old daughter was already experiencing abandonment trauma, not from losing caregivers, but from never being allowed to truly connect with them in the first place. Isabella had learned to be polite and compliant, sitting quietly during structured play sessions and eating her organic meals without complaint. But anyone who looked closely could see the sadness in her dark eyes, the way she clutched a worn stuffed rabbit that had been her only constant companion since birth. The latest nanny, Miss Davies, had quit just that morning after Isabella had refused to stop crying during her scheduled nap time. "The child is clearly emotionally disturbed," she'd declared. "She needs therapeutic intervention, not childcare." Standing in his home office, surrounded by glowing monitors displaying real-time stock prices and global market data, Alexander felt a familiar surge of frustration. He could manage billion-dollar acquisitions and navigate complex international negotiations, but he couldn't figure out how to make his own daughter happy. His personal assistant had already contacted the most exclusive domestic staffing agencies in the country, but Alexander was beginning to suspect that the problem might not be finding the right professional. It might be his entire approach to Isabella's care. That's when Mrs. Chen, his longtime housekeeper, knocked on his office door with an unusual request. "Mr. Blackstone, my niece Carmen is looking for work. She's been caring for her elderly mother, but her mother passed last month. She has experience with children, and she's very gentle." Alexander barely looked up from his computer. "Does she have formal training certifications in child development or early childhood education?" "No, sir. But she raised her younger siblings after their mother died, and she worked as a nurse's aide for many years. She understands children who are hurting." The word hurting stopped Alexander cold. He'd never thought of Isabella as hurting. She had everything a child could want. The best toys, the finest clothes, educational opportunities that most families could never afford. How could she be hurting? But as he looked out his office window and saw Isabella sitting alone in the garden, mechanically feeding her rabbit, while her latest nanny packed her bags, Alexander realized that maybe formal credentials weren't what his daughter needed. Maybe she needed someone who understood that a child's heart couldn't be managed with professional protocols and structured schedules. Carmen Santos arrived the next morning carrying nothing but a small suitcase and a worn leather Bible that had belonged to her grandmother. She was 42 years old, with gentle eyes and work-worn hands that spoke of a lifetime spent caring for others. Her references came not from wealthy families or prestigious agencies, but from neighbors, patients, and children who remembered her kindness years later. Alexander met her in the foyer, immediately noting her lack of the crisp professional uniform he'd grown accustomed to seeing on his employees. Carmen wore a simple navy dress and comfortable shoes, her graying hair pulled back in a practical bun that somehow managed to look both neat and maternal. "I should be clear about my expectations." Alexander began, launching into the same speech he'd given every previous caregiver. "Isabella requires structure and consistency. I don't want her forming inappropriate attachments or developing dependency issues that will be disruptive when circumstances change." Carmen nodded politely, but her attention was already focused on the small figure she could see through the living room doorway, a little girl with dark curls sitting perfectly still on an expensive sofa, her arms wrapped around a stuffed rabbit as if it were her only friend in the world. "Where is her mother?" Carmen asked quietly. "Isabella's mother died during childbirth," Alexander replied curtly, "which is why it's crucial that she learn appropriate boundaries with caregivers. I won't have her confusing professional care with family relationships." Carmen's heart broke a little as she watched Isabella, recognizing the particular kind of stillness that came from a child who had learned that showing emotion led to disappointment. She'd seen it before in her work with grieving families, and she knew that no amount of professional distance could heal what this little girl was missing. Carmen's first day with Isabella began like all the others had, with careful distance and professional politeness. She introduced herself, formally explained the day's schedule, and attempted to engage the little girl in age-appropriate educational activities. But as the hours passed, Carmen began to see through Isabella's carefully constructed compliance to the lonely child underneath. When they played with puzzles, Isabella would glance up hopefully each time she completed a section, as if waiting for praise that never came with the enthusiasm she craved. During snack time, she ate her organic fruit and whole grain crackers with mechanical precision, never asking for seconds or expressing preferences. It was during Isabella's afternoon quiet time that Carmen's professional resolve began to crack. The little girl lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling with wide, sleepless eyes while clutching her stuffed rabbit. She wasn't crying or complaining. She'd learned that such displays of emotion were discouraged, but her small body radiated a sadness that was impossible to ignore. Carmen sat in the chair beside Isabella's bed, officially there to ensure the child rested properly. But as she watched this beautiful little girl struggle with the kind of loneliness that no 4-year-old should have to bear, she found herself humming softly a lullaby her own grandmother had sung to her decades earlier in their small apartment in East LA. The effect was immediate and heartbreaking. Isabella turned toward the sound like a flower following sunlight, her dark eyes focusing on Carmen's face with an intensity that spoke of desperate hunger for connection. Arroró mi niño, arroró mi sol. Carmen sang quietly, the Spanish words flowing like honey. Arroró pedazo de mi corazón. Isabella didn't understand the language, but she understood the love woven through every note. For the first time since Carmen had arrived, the little girl's body relaxed. Her death grip on the stuffed rabbit loosened, and her eyelids began to flutter closed. Carmen continued singing until Isabella's breathing deepened into genuine sleep. The first peaceful nap she'd taken in weeks, according to the detailed reports left by previous caregivers. We've all heard lullabies that made us feel safe, haven't we? There's something universal about a gentle voice singing us to sleep, promising that we're loved and protected. Over the following days, Carmen's lullabies became Isabella's lifeline to the maternal comfort she'd never known. Each evening after completing the structured activities that Alexander's schedule required, Carmen would sit beside Isabella's bed and sing softly in Spanish and English. She sang the songs her grandmother had taught her, the ones she'd sung to her younger siblings, and the lullabies she'd hummed to countless patients during her years as a nurse's aide. Isabella began to transform under this gentle care. The rigid compliance that had characterized her behavior started giving way to genuine curiosity and joy. She asked questions about the songs, tried to hum along with the melodies, and most remarkably, began to smile real smiles that lit up her entire face. Carmen's approach to childcare was intuitive rather than academic. When Isabella scraped her knee in the garden, Carmen didn't just apply antiseptic and a bandage. She kissed the hurt better and told her a story about brave little girls who healed quickly because they were loved. When Isabella was frustrated with a difficult puzzle, Carmen didn't lecture about persistence and problem-solving skills. She sat on the floor and worked through it together, celebrating each small success with genuine enthusiasm. What Carmen understood from her own experience growing up in a large family with limited resources was that children needed to feel cherished for who they were, not just praised for what they accomplished. Isabella had plenty of people who evaluated her development and monitored her progress, but she'd never had someone who simply delighted in her existence. The change didn't go unnoticed by the household staff. Mrs. Chen, who had recommended Carmen for the position, smiled when she heard Isabella's laughter echoing through the halls for the first time in months. Even the gardener commented on how the little girl had started picking flowers to give to Mama Carmen, a nickname she'd begun using when she thought no adults were listening. Isabella's bedtime routine became the highlight of both their days. Carmen would help her into her pajamas, brush her dark curls until they shined, and then settle into the rocking chair that had been gathering dust in the corner of the nursery. As she sang her grandmother's lullabies, Isabella would curl up in her bed, no longer clutching her stuffed rabbit desperately, but holding it contentedly, while watching Carmen's face with adoring eyes. "Mama Carmen," Isabella whispered one evening after a particularly sweet lullaby about angels watching over sleeping children. "Will you sing the star song again?" Carmen's heart clenched at the innocent trust in those words. She'd been called many things in her life, sister, caregiver, friend, but never mama. The word filled a hollow space in her chest that had been empty since losing her own daughter to childhood leukemia 15 years earlier. "Of course, mija," she whispered back, using the Spanish endearment that came as naturally as breathing. "Close your eyes and listen." As Carmen sang about stars that watched over little children and guardian angels who never slept, Isabella drifted off with a peace that had been missing from her life since birth. For the first time, she felt truly safe, truly loved, and truly at home in her own house. Comment below if you remember a caregiver who showed you unconditional love. There's something magical about those people who see straight through to our hearts, isn't there? But this beautiful connection that was healing Isabella's wounded spirit was about to face its greatest test. Alexander Blackstone was starting to notice the changes in his daughter, and not all of his observations filled him with the relief that Carmen had expected. Isabella was happier, more animated, more engaging than she'd ever been. But she was also calling a housekeeper Mama, and forming exactly the kind of inappropriate attachment that Alexander had spent 4 years trying to prevent. The confrontation that would change everything was only days away. The crisis came on a Thursday evening, when Alexander returned home early from a business dinner that had ended abruptly. As he walked through the marble foyer, removing his expensive watch and loosening his tie, he heard something that stopped him cold, the sound of his daughter giggling with pure, uninhibited joy. Following the sound, Alexander found himself outside Isabella's bedroom door, which had been left slightly ajar. What he saw inside made his blood run cold with a mixture of emotions he couldn't quite name. Carmen sat in the antique rocking chair, gently swaying back and forth as she sang a Spanish lullaby in her rich, warm voice. Isabella was curled up in her bed, but instead of lying rigidly under her covers, as she usually did, she was animated and engaged, trying to sing, along with words she didn't understand, but melodies that clearly filled her with happiness. "Mama Carmen," Isabella said as the song ended, "tell me about the angels again, the ones that watch little girls while they sleep. I can't imagine how you'd feel watching this unfold. What would you do in Alexander's position?" The word mama hit Alexander like a physical blow. In that moment, he saw everything he'd been trying to prevent happening right before his eyes. His daughter was forming an inappropriate attachment to an employee, calling her by the most sacred title in a child's vocabulary, and clearly bonding in ways that would make her eventual departure devastating. Alexander cleared his throat loudly, causing both Carmen and Isabella to look toward the doorway. Carmen immediately stood up, her hands smoothing her dress as her professional demeanor snapped back into place. "Miss Blackstone," she said quietly, "I was just getting Isabella ready for sleep." "I can see that," Alexander replied, his voice controlled but clearly displeased. "Isabella, say goodnight to Miss Santos. We need to talk." Isabella's face fell at her father's formal tone. "But Daddy, Mama Carmen hasn't finished the angel story." "Miss Santos is not your mama," Alexander said firmly. "She's an employee, and employees don't tell bedtime stories, they follow schedules." The hurt that flashed across Isabella's face was quickly replaced by the familiar mask of compliance that broke Carmen's heart. "Yes, Daddy," the little girl whispered, sinking back into her pillows. Alexander waited until Carmen had left the room before sitting on the edge of Isabella's bed. "Sweetheart, you can't call Miss Santos Mama. She's here to take care of you, but she's not your family. Do you understand?" Isabella nodded, but tears were pooling in her dark eyes. "Yes, Daddy." The next morning, Alexander called Carmen into his study. She stood before his massive desk, her hands clasped in front of her, knowing that this conversation would determine Isabella's future happiness. "Miss Santos," Alexander began, his voice businesslike and cold, "I'm afraid your employment here is no longer working out. You've overstepped appropriate boundaries with my daughter, and I can't allow that to continue." Carmen felt her heart breaking, not for herself, but for the little girl who would wake up tomorrow to find that another caregiver had disappeared from her life. "Mr. Blackstone, Isabella is thriving. She's happier than she's been since I've known her. Isn't that what matters?" "What matters," Alexander replied sharply, "is that she learn appropriate relationships and boundaries. You've allowed her to become inappropriately attached to you, and when you leave, as all employees eventually do, she'll be devastated. I won't have her heartbroken because you couldn't maintain professional distance." This next part broke my heart, and I think it will break yours too. Carmen gathered her few belongings that afternoon, while Isabella was having her scheduled educational time with a tutor. Alexander had arranged for Mrs. Patterson, the Norland-trained nanny, to return the following Monday. Everything would go back to the structured, emotionally distant care that Alexander believed was best for his daughter. But Isabella's reaction to Carmen's disappearance was immediate and catastrophic. When she realized that Mama Carmen was gone, she became inconsolable in a way that terrified everyone in the house. She wouldn't eat, wouldn't sleep, wouldn't engage with the activities that had previously occupied her time. Mrs. Patterson arrived on Monday morning to find a little girl who had regressed to a state worse than before Carmen's arrival. Isabella sat in her room clutching her stuffed rabbit, rocking back and forth in the same self-soothing motion that had worried previous caregivers. "Isabella," Mrs. Patterson said briskly, consulting her clipboard of scheduled activities. "It's time for your morning educational period. We'll be working on letter recognition today." Isabella didn't respond. She continued rocking her lips, moving silently as she tried to remember the words to Carmen's lullabies. For 3 days, Isabella barely spoke. She picked at her meals, stared blankly during lessons, and spent most of her time searching the house as if looking for someone who was never coming back. Wait until you hear what happened next. You won't believe it. On Wednesday evening, as Alexander sat in his study reviewing quarterly reports, he heard a sound that made his blood freeze. Isabella was crying, not the quiet, controlled tears he was used to, but the desperate, heartbroken sobs of a child whose world had collapsed. He found her in the living room, standing in the spot where Carmen's rocking chair had been, her small body shaking with grief that was too large for her to contain. "Daddy!" she sobbed, looking up at him with eyes full of pain and confusion. "Where is my mama?" Alexander knelt beside his daughter, trying to find words that would comfort her. "Sweetheart, Miss Santos had to go away, but Mrs. Patterson is here to take care of you." Isabella shook her head violently. "No, I want my mama. I want Mama Carmen." And then, in a moment that would replay in Alexander's mind for the rest of his life, Isabella spoke the word that shattered every assumption he'd held about appropriate boundaries and professional relationships. "Mama," she screamed, her voice carrying through the marble halls of their empty mansion. "Mama, mama, mama." This moment changed everything. Are you ready? It was the first time in Isabella's 4 years of life that she had called out for a mother, and the person she was calling for wasn't the woman who had died giving birth to her, but the black woman who had sung lullabies and kissed scraped knees and seen straight through to her lonely heart. In that moment, Alexander finally understood what he had done. He hadn't protected his daughter from inappropriate attachment he had stolen from her, the first real maternal love she had ever known. Alexander didn't sleep that night. He sat in his study staring at his phone, wrestling with a pride that suddenly seemed insignificant compared to his daughter's happiness. At 6 a.m., he called Carmen. "Miss Santos," he said when she answered, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and regret. "I made a terrible mistake. Isabella needs you. I need you. Would you consider coming back?" Carmen returned that same morning to find Isabella still in her pajamas, refusing to get dressed or eat breakfast. But the moment she heard Carmen's voice in the foyer, the little girl ran down the marble staircase faster than she'd ever moved in her life. "Mama Carmen," Isabella cried, launching herself into Carmen's arms with the kind of desperate relief that comes from thinking you'd lost everything that mattered. "I'm here, mija," Carmen whispered, holding the little girl close while tears streamed down her own face. "I'm here, and I'm never leaving again." Alexander watched this reunion from the top of the stairs, finally understanding that love couldn't be managed, scheduled, or controlled. It could only be recognized, honored, and protected. 6 months later, the Blackstone house hummed with the kind of warmth that money couldn't buy. Carmen had officially become Isabella's guardian, as well as Alexander's most trusted advisor on matters of the heart. Isabella called her Mama Carmen, with Alexander's full blessing, and every evening the sound of Spanish lullabies floated through halls that had finally become a home. Alexander had learned that the most important boundaries weren't the ones that kept people apart, but the ones that kept love safe to grow. If this story touched your heart like it touched mine, there are so many more incredible stories of ordinary people changing lives in extraordinary ways. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because next week I'm sharing the story of a school janitor whose simple act of kindness saved a millionaire's autistic son when 12 therapists couldn't. And the week after that, you'll meet the housekeeper who used a $3 packet of seeds to heal a family that expensive therapy couldn't reach. These stories remind us that love, compassion, and human connection are the most powerful forces in the world. Which story has touched you the most so far? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one, and your thoughts inspire the stories I choose to share next. Until next time, remember, the smallest acts of love can create the biggest miracles.